Have you ever found yourself wondering why so many relationships between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law turn tense, distant, or even cold often, without any clear reason? Why do those awkward feelings linger? Those subtle glances exchanged across the dinner table, or that heavy silence that settles in during family get-togethers? Maybe you've gone through it yourself. Maybe you're going through it now. That quiet sense of being judged, of not quite belonging in your own son's home, or the nagging feeling that no matter what you do, you're never quite good enough. Other times, the discomfort is more veiled, hidden behind offhand remarks, unintentional comparisons, or critiques that show up dressed as helpful suggestions. Sigmund Freud taught us that the things we don't say often speak the loudest, that the hardest conflicts to explain are rarely about logic or language. They're shadows left behind by the unconscious stories inherited, repeated, and rarely recognized. To Freud, the unconscious was the deep, hidden part of our minds where unspoken desires, buried pain, and unresolved emotions gather. And from that quiet place rise some of our strongest feelings: resentment, jealousy, rivalry. When tension grows between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, there's often more beneath the surface than meets the eye. A rich emotional undercurrent full of symbolism, unhealed wounds, and imagined roles. Most of the time, the struggle isn't about who controls the home. It's about something deeper, a desire to be seen, acknowledged, valued. It's less about physical presence and more about emotional belonging. Often what really fuels the tension isn't even rooted in the present moment, but in echoes from the past. Childhood memories, early experiences with mothers or romantic partners. All of it lives in the background, shaping how we respond without even realizing it. Psychoanalysis doesn't offer simple etiquette rules or cookie-cutter advice to smooth these situations over. Instead, it invites us to ask deeper questions. What kind of hurt is surfacing here? What role does each woman represent to the other? What old scar is touched every time there's a cold glance or a comment that lands too hard? Freud believed that our minds naturally repeat what we haven't fully worked through. This tendency, what he called the repetition compulsion, is our unconscious effort to resolve what's still unresolved. So a mother-in-law who once felt excluded by her own mother-in-law might unknowingly recreate that same distance with her son's wife. A daughter-in-law who grew up feeling constantly judged by her mother may instinctively put up defenses around older women even without meaning to. The roles shift, repeat, and sometimes become indistinguishable. This conversation isn't about assigning blame. It's not about setting rules for how to get along. It's about shining a light on the unseen forces that shape our reactions. The more we understand what drives us, the more freedom we gain to choose how we want to live. At their core, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law are women first. Women with stories. Women who have loved deeply, lost painfully, and carried their own private burdens. They've been daughters, wives, caretakers. They've fought battles both out in the world and within themselves. And for that, they deserve to be seen not as opponents, but as mirrors reflecting back unspoken truths. Exploring what stirs in the unconscious female experience isn't just a personal journey. It's a chance to break free, a chance to step out of cycles that wound and make space for a more mature, more mindful way of relating. So today, let's take our time and look closely at this subject with honesty, with care, and above all with respect. Because this isn't about winning a family feud. It's about understanding where the pain began. And maybe, just maybe, discovering a pathway to peace, not just with each other, but with ourselves. Now let's revisit the Oedipal triangle: mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and the son. Freud saw the Oedipus complex as a central pillar of how the human psyche forms. While often misunderstood, it's not really about literal family drama. It's about the deeper emotional themes: longing, competition, ownership, identity. In those early childhood years, a young child forms a powerful emotional attachment to the parent of the opposite sex, while simultaneously developing an unconscious sense of rivalry with the parent of the same sex. This is a universal and unconscious process. Through it, we start to understand the boundaries of desire, the experience of frustration, and the inevitability of loss. As children begin to realize they cannot replace their mother or father in the heart of the other parent, they start to build their own separate identity. This step is critical for emotional growth. But what happens when this symbolic triangle, which seemed settled in childhood, reappears later in life, only now with different people? This scenario often resurfaces in the dynamic between a mother-in-law, her daughter-in-law, and her son. The triangle returns in disguise. The mother who once was at the center of her son's emotional world now finds herself replaced by a younger woman who has taken over the space of intimacy, attention, and importance. The daughter-in-law, for her part, tries to claim her place by her partner's side, but runs into a lingering presence that still holds emotional sway over him. The son ends up torn between two deeply important women. On one side is the mother who represents love, nurturing, and upbringing. On the other is the partner he wishes to build a grown-up life with. And while it might look like a simple matter of family logistics, this tension runs much deeper beneath the surface. It's not just about who visits more often, who cooks better, or who wins a petty argument. At the heart of it lies a deeper question: who truly holds his affection? Who matters more, whose voice carries weight in his decisions? Freud pointed out that the unconscious doesn't work in chronological time. It operates through patterns, symbols, and repetition. That's why a mother who has never emotionally processed her son's departure into adulthood might, without realizing it, reenact a reversed version of the Oedipus complex. She begins to feel cast aside, unwanted, replaced. Her resentment toward her daughter-in-law isn't only about how the younger woman acts today. It's tied to the painful sense of losing something she believes is rightfully hers, the unshaken love of her child. At the same time, the son often gets stuck in this triangle too, struggling to draw healthy boundaries. He fears hurting his mother and carries guilt for stepping away, yet he also wants to stand by his partner. The result is a constant emotional tug-of-war where no one feels entirely secure. The daughter-in-law often finds herself dropped into this situation without really grasping what's happening. She senses the stares, the veiled remarks, the underlying tension, but she can't quite understand why her very presence causes such unease. She feels forced into competing for her partner's love against his mother, even though she never intended to. That silent battle wears her down, making her feel like she's falling short, like she doesn't belong, like she's being pushed away. This unspoken triangle shows up in small, subtle ways: side comments, long pauses, heavy silences. Sunday dinners start to feel like emotional minefields. Visiting the mother-in-law becomes a strained duty. Affection gives way to cautious observation, where everyone is on alert, scanning for signs of criticism or disapproval. Psychoanalysis teaches us that to move beyond this triangle, we must confront the idea of symbolic loss. The mother needs to come to terms with the fact that her son has grown up, that her role has shifted, and that love hasn't disappeared. It has simply taken a new shape. The son must step up and navigate this shift with emotional maturity, making boundaries clear and holding them without shame. And the daughter-in-law needs to understand that even if the mother-in-law lashes out, there may be an old buried wound at the root of it all, something that's never been put into words. Once the triangle is acknowledged, it starts to lose its hidden grip. What once felt threatening becomes more understandable, a phase of life, a changing of roles, the close of one chapter and the start of a new one. Not one of conflict, but of mutual recognition and respect. Now let's turn our attention to another hidden struggle: female envy and rivalry lurking beneath the surface. Freud understood envy as a deeply rooted human emotion, one that often emerges without us even realizing it whenever we see something in someone else that we wish we had. Within the world of women, this feeling tends to show up in subtle, intricate ways. It's not always open hostility. Sometimes it wears the mask of a gentle jab, a carefully worded compliment, or a look that carries just enough disdain to be felt. Underneath those small acts is a quiet ache, the sense that something once yours now belongs to someone else. This dynamic becomes especially delicate in the relationship between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. The older woman often views the younger with a comparative gaze. In her, she may see a youthfulness she no longer feels, a body that's firmer, a voice that's heard more clearly, a sense of freedom she was never allowed to fully explore. Most of all, she sees an emotional closeness with her son that no longer belongs to her. It's vital to clarify this isn't about intentional cruelty. There's no conscious wish to hurt anyone. What surfaces is a buildup of silent frustrations, choices made without recognition, sacrifices that were never fully acknowledged. Many women from past generations spent their lives serving others. They cared for children, supported their husbands, tended to the home. They put their own desires aside in the name of family. They were taught to please, to endure, to give of themselves without question. And now, facing a new generation of women who express themselves more freely, set firmer boundaries, demand to be heard, something stirs within them. It's a complex mix of admiration and resentment. The daughter-in-law, often unaware, becomes a symbol of all the things the mother-in-law never had a chance to become. She stands for a version of womanhood that simply wasn't available to the older generation. This can stir up a quiet anger, not necessarily toward the younger woman herself, but toward everything she represents: someone raised in a world with more rights, more choices, more room to be heard. So the real struggle isn't with the daughter-in-law. It's with the story of the mother-in-law's own life, with the constraints she had to accept the dreams she had to leave behind. Freud reminds us that the unconscious remembers what the mind may try to forget. It holds on to unresolved feelings, unspoken love, words that were swallowed. And eventually those buried emotions return, often triggered by someone close. A mother-in-law may unknowingly project her discomfort onto her daughter-in-law, stirred by the painful awareness that time has passed and certain doors will never open again. That kind of sorrow, hard to name or explain, turns into criticism. Suddenly, the younger woman is seen as careless too, assertive, emotionally distant, not fitting in with the family. These labels often cover something far more tender: envy. That's why Freud placed such importance on bringing the unconscious into the light. When we can name what we're feeling, we're less likely to act out in ways we don't understand. A mother-in-law who recognizes her envy not as a moral failure, but as a sign of deeper hurt, is already beginning to grow. And this kind of growth is more than just about improving a relationship. It's a shift in the psyche. Likewise, a daughter-in-law who starts to see that her mother-in-law's hostility may be rooted in long past experiences, not in anything she's done, finds a new kind of freedom. She stops taking it all so personally and begins to grasp the bigger emotional picture. This doesn't mean she has to accept mistreatment or keep quiet. It means responding with more maturity to a conflict that often stretches across generations. Envy often comes with shame. No one likes to admit they feel it. But psychoanalysis encourages us to look at envy without judgment. When we recognize it for what it is, envy can point to old dreams that still matter, to values we hold dear, to goals we haven't yet reached. Most of all, It can lead us toward healing and peace with our own past. In the end, rivalry only loses its grip when we truly listen to ourselves, to each other. Because beneath every feeling of resentment lies a longing to be seen, to be acknowledged, to still have a place in someone's heart. In many of Freud's writings, he pointed out that maternal love holds a key place in shaping a woman's emotional world. When motherhood becomes the centerpiece of a woman's identity, especially in circumstances where other expressions of desire, such as career, sexuality, or personal independence, have been pushed aside, the child can end up carrying a symbolic weight far beyond what's natural. He stops being just a child and becomes part of her ego, an object of emotional and even narcissistic investment. In early childhood, this bond is essential. A mother is a child's first emotional anchor, the first mirror reflecting their inner world. But over time, that bond is meant to evolve. As the child matures, he starts to claim his independence, building new connections, and looking to other sources for meaning and affection. That's the natural course of things, though it's often anything but easy, especially when for the mother that child has come to represent her main source of validation, companionship, and emotional purpose. Marriage puts this quiet transition to the test. All at once, another woman enters his inner circle. She's the one he sleeps next to, confides and listens to. To the mother, it feels as though this new woman has stepped right into a role that used to belong to her. And it's not about physical space. It's emotional territory, the most tender, cherished part of the heart. What she experiences isn't simply the loss of her son's attention, but the haunting feeling of being replaced. This sense of losing one's place strikes a nerve deep in the unconscious where self-worth lives. Freud called it a narcissistic injury, something that shakes the ideal image we have of ourselves. In this case, the blow doesn't come from direct criticism, but from the silent presence of someone who marks the end of an era. Without meaning to, the daughter-in-law becomes a living reminder of time's passage, lost youth, and a central role that no longer exists. That's why for many mothers-in-law, tension with the new wife doesn't begin with conflict. It begins with her very presence. It only takes the appearance of this new woman for the mother's mind to register a subtle growing threat. This rivalry may not be conscious. It might show up as overbearing kindness, meddling disguised as concern, or critique cloaked in good intentions. But behind all that is the fear of becoming irrelevant, of no longer being loved in the same way. Freud believed that the longing to stay at the center of someone else's life is one of the most refined expressions of narcissism. Not vanity in the common sense, but the deep human need to believe we're irreplaceable. So when a mother sees her son turning more to his wife, confiding in her, reshaping his life without her input, that illusion is shattered. And with it comes real pain. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, often feels burdened by an unspoken expectation, one she can never quite meet. It's as if she's constantly having to prove she deserves her place. Even when she tries to be kind, accommodating, or respectful, the tension doesn't fade. That's because the discomfort isn't about what she does, but about what she represents. Escaping this emotional gridlock takes inner work, and it rarely happens without effort. The mother-in-law has to take a hard, honest look inward and ask herself, what does my son truly mean to me? Why does his new relationship unsettle me so much? What part of me feels left behind? These questions are tough, but they open the door to freedom. Once a mother can accept that her role has changed, that this shift doesn't erase love, only transforms it, she can begin to carve out a new place in her son's life. One that may be less central, but more grounded, more honest, a place where there's no need to compete, only to be present. The daughter-in-law also needs to understand that it's not her duty to heal her mother-in-law's wounds, yet she can, through empathy, acknowledge that behind the bitterness lies a woman who once had dreams, fears, and love stories of her own. Women from different generations can build bridges when they stop viewing one another as adversaries and start seeing themselves as inheritors of similar emotional legacies. In the end, the fear of being replaced doesn't have to feel like a loss. It can be seen as a passage, and any passage, no matter how painful, carries the chance to begin again. Freud and the child's place in the mother's desire. Freud believed that maternal love was among the deepest and most vital expressions of psychic life. Yet he also cautioned that, like any human emotion, it can turn complex and even damaging when it begins to serve unresolved unconscious needs. There is a fragile moment when genuine care starts to blend with unmet longings, when affection slips into control and the child is no longer an independent being, but becomes the emotional anchor for the mother's inner life. This pattern is far more common than most would assume and isn't confined to extreme cases. Many women, without meaning to form a bond with their child that stretches beyond the bounds of typical motherhood, that child begins to represent a kind of salvation, an answer to the emptiness left by a loveless marriage, a failed partnership, or years lived in solitude. Over time, this son becomes idealized as the one who listens, who understands, who remains unconditionally present, and in this ideal, he takes on a central, almost irreplaceable role. But this role isn't meant to be permanent. The psychological task of motherhood, Freud emphasized, is to prepare the child to move on. A good enough mother is one who loves deeply, but also enough to let her child go emotionally, symbolically, and physically. Yet, when that child becomes the emotional core of her existence, the process of separation becomes nearly unbearable. The moment her son enters into a relationship, that inner system begins to crumble. The daughter-in-law doesn't just arrive as a new person to love. She enters a space that for years belonged solely to the mother. And this isn't just about jealousy or disapproval. It's about something far more profound, a symbolic loss. Though it may never be spoken aloud, the mother-in-law often feels robbed, not in a literal way, but emotionally. What's slipping away isn't just her son, but the role she played in her own sense of identity. Freud might describe this as a displaced libidinal investment. Rather than distributing her emotional energy across many parts of life, friendships, passions, work, faith, personal joy, it all becomes channeled into one person, her son. And when that person starts to drift, what surfaces is not just sadness, it's the collapse of a long-standing emotional framework. It's not merely the absence of a loved one. It's the unraveling of something she's held on to for years. This is why, even if she's done nothing wrong, the daughter-in-law can come to be seen as a threat. No matter how respectful or kind she may be in the unconscious world of the mother-in-law, she represents the undoing of a cherished fantasy, that her son would always stay, always choose her, always need her. And that fantasy, even if quietly held, was a cornerstone of her sense of self, a way to feel alive, important, indispensable. Freud taught that psychological suffering often comes when we cling to a structure that no longer serves its purpose. When a mother continues to expect from her son what he can no longer give, conflict arises. And the grief of loss disguises itself as anger, bitterness, and constant criticism. The mother-in-law starts judging her son's partner for her clothes, her speech, her cooking, the way she keeps the house. But beneath all that, the real issue isn't the daughter-in-law. It's the aching emptiness that remains. Recognizing this truth is painful, but also freeing. When the mother begins to understand that her son is not there to complete her story, she can begin a new one. She can finally reconnect with herself, with her desires, her dreams, and the parts of her identity that have long been buried beneath the weight of total motherhood. And the daughter-in-law too can grow through this awareness, understanding that her mother-in-law's hostility may not be personal, but rather a reflection of deep symbolic loss, allows her to respond with emotional maturity rather than being pulled into petty battles. This doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment or injustice. It means refusing to keep fueling a rivalry that's often rooted in unspoken inherited pain. In this situation, the child plays a crucial role. It's up to them to acknowledge their independence while still embracing their mother with compassion. That doesn't mean feeling guilty, but rather standing firm, because part of growing up is learning how to set boundaries within love. The goal isn't to stop loving. It's to love in a new way, a way that doesn't bind, but releases, that doesn't demand, but welcomes, that doesn't feed on dependence, but thrives in healthy separation. Freud understood this well. It's one of the hardest challenges and greatest victories in our emotional lives. Transference and projection. What a mother-in-law sees in her daughter-in-law. When Freud delved deep into the workings of the human mind, he identified two of the unconscious's most influential forces: transference and projection. These aren't limited to therapy rooms. They're deeply woven into many human connections, especially the ones marked by strong feelings and emotional history. Between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law, these forces can be subtle, but incredibly powerful. Transference happens when old emotions typically linked to significant figures from one's past, like parents, siblings, or caretakers, get redirected towards someone in the present. Projection, on the other hand, involves assigning to someone else the feelings, urges, or traits we either don't recognize in ourselves or can't bear to accept. When these two processes mix, they create a sort of warped mirror. We stop seeing the person in front of us and begin to see fragments of our own forgotten, denied, or painful memories reflected in them. This is exactly what can play out between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. Often the daughter-in-law becomes a stage for the reenactment of past emotional experiences the mother-in-law had with other women in her life. She might see in her daughter-in-law the shadow of a sister she always felt in competition with, or a critical, emotionally distant mother, or even a woman from her past, maybe a neighbor colleague or rival, who made her feel small, unimportant, or invisible. That's why the mother-in-law's emotional reactions toward her daughter-in-law may seem out of proportion to what's actually happening. A simple comment from the daughter-in-law might come across as an insult. A neutral gesture could be read as scorn. Silence might be taken as rejection. And most of the time, the daughter-in-law has no clue why she's being met with coldness or hostility. That's because it's not logical, it's symbolic. Without realizing it, she's stepped into an emotional role that was already written before she entered the picture. But projection doesn't just apply to others. It can also be aimed at parts of ourselves we haven't come to terms with. For instance, the mother-in-law may recognize in her daughter-in-law a kind of freedom she herself never got to enjoy a youth long gone, or an emotional self-sufficiency she had to suppress. Instead of seeing this as something to admire, she turns those feelings into criticism, because it's often easier to go after in others what still hurts inside us. This type of projection grows stronger when the mother-in-law starts to feel like she's losing her place within the family. The presence of the daughter-in-law seems threatening, not because the younger woman is actually taking anything away, but because she stirs up buried memories of past losses. Losses that were never truly grieved, only silenced. Freud always emphasized that real insight begins when we stop resisting these inner patterns and begin to face them, because facing them is how change begins. When the mother-in-law comes to understand that her daughter-in-law isn't an enemy, but a symbol onto whom she's been projecting old emotional baggage, something shifts inside. She starts to see her daughter-in-law as a person in her own right, someone with her own wounds, fears and desires, not just a distorted image from the past. The same applies to the daughter-in-law. She might be projecting her own fears and scars onto her mother-in-law, perhaps seeing in her the stern authority figure who's always made her feel intimidated, or a mother figure who was never emotionally present and against whom she's been unconsciously trying to rebel. When both women begin to recognize this dynamic, something new becomes possible in their relationship. Not perfection, but breathing room. A space where they're no longer ruled by ghosts. It's important to understand that this isn't about blaming anyone. The mother-in-law isn't a villain, and the daughter-in-law isn't a helpless victim. They're both women in the middle of their own journeys, carrying stories, bearing scars, and holding on to dreams they may have had to leave behind. When one woman becomes the mirror of another, tension is almost certain, but within that strain lies a hidden chance for shared growth. Breaking the pattern of resentment begins by choosing to see differently. Instead of viewing the other as an opponent, we start to see a reflection, one that may reveal behind every sharp word a buried admiration we've been unwilling to admit. Beneath anger, there may be hidden sorrow. Beneath conflict, a quiet plea, see me, hear me, understand me. The daughter-in-law often stirs echoes of the past that have never been laid to rest. Freud spoke plainly, whatever we push away into the unconscious doesn't vanish. It waits silent and unseen until the moment is right to return, disguised, redirected sometimes, even wearing a new face. One of the clearest arenas where these returns tend to happen is in the dynamic between a mother-in-law and her son's wife. Before she became a mother-in-law, this woman was once a daughter herself, a bride, a young woman, perhaps, even a daughter-in-law. And along the way, she may have gathered many wounds that were never fully acknowledged. Perhaps her own mother-in-law treated her poorly. Maybe she lived in a marriage where her voice was rarely heard. She may have set aside her dreams, stifled her desires in the name of duty, family, or just making it through. These kinds of experiences, especially when never spoken of, don't simply disappear. They leave marks. They become unfinished chapters that still echo in her emotional life. When a new daughter-in-law enters the picture, she may unknowingly stir all of those old stories. Not because she's done anything wrong, but simply because her presence triggers something deeper, something symbolic. The mother-in-law might begin reliving roles she thought she had left behind, now cast in a new light. The young woman standing before her is a reminder not just of youth, but of missed chances, of roads not taken. For women who have spent their lives suppressing parts of themselves watching a younger woman speak up, set boundaries and claim her space can be deeply unsettling. It's not always because they disagree with her behavior. It's because in her, they see the version of themselves that never got to fully exist. They see courage they never dared show. They hear a voice they were once forced to quiet. This kind of mirror is painful, and it often triggers reactive behavior. Harsh remarks, constant criticism efforts to push someone away. These don't spring from today's interaction alone. They're rooted in something far older, in pain that was never soothed, in resentment that was never given a name. Without realizing it, the daughter-in-law becomes the reflection in which the mother-in-law sees everything she lost. Freud described this as symbolic repetition. When we don't work through a wound, we recreate it. We repeat it in new settings, hoping without even knowing it that this time something might heal. But unless we recognize the pattern, the suffering just keeps cycling. The woman who was once shamed becomes the one who shames. The one who was silenced now silences others. The one who was left out now excludes. And so it passes down mother to daughter, generation after generation. But there is a way to step out of the pattern. And it begins with one brave step: recognition. When a mother-in-law looks honestly at her own past, she may see that her frustration isn't truly about her daughter-in-law. It's about the weight she's carried for years, the heartaches she never voiced, the loneliness that has walked beside her for so long. And this awareness doesn't weaken her, it sets her free. Because when she sees that her pain belongs to another time, she no longer needs to fight in the present. She can choose calm where once she would have lashed out. She can find peace where there was only reactivity before. There comes a moment when, instead of raising defenses, one might choose to offer shelter. What was once a battleground could become a resting place. A mother-in-law might even discover an unexpected ally in her daughter-in-law, a bridge to reevaluate her own journey. And the daughter-in-law, in turn, might gain from this understanding. If she realizes that certain behaviors from her mother-in-law aren't personal attacks, but remnants of past wounds, she may decide not to get drawn into emotional battles. This isn't about tolerating disrespect. It's about refusing to feed the tension. It's a way to break the cycle without surrendering one's dignity. Freud taught us that healing begins when we can name what we feel. Once what has been repressed is brought into awareness, it loses its power to hurt. The past remains what it was, but it no longer controls the present. When a mother-in-law reaches this awareness, she begins to inhabit life differently, with more grace, with greater maturity, more attuned to what truly matters. In the end, perhaps the daughter-in-law was never the problem. Perhaps she is simply the messenger, unknowingly carrying echoes of a time that still longs for resolution. And if that message is finally heard, there may be room for a different kind of connection, one that's more genuine, more human, and no longer burdened by shadows of the past. The intruder in the female unconscious. The loss of the symbolic throne. Psychoanalysis reveals that a woman's unconscious holds deep-rooted symbols, archetypal images, and lifelong roles that shape her sense of self. One of the most dominant is that of the central figure in the home, the one who keeps things running, who welcomes others, who shares her thoughts, who serves as the living memory of the family. Many women, particularly in traditional settings, grow up with the unspoken belief that one day they will become this central figure, the matriarch, the trusted advisor, the emotional anchor of the family. Even if never explicitly stated, this role is carefully built through years of gestures, daily habits, and quiet dedication. Over time, it becomes something like a symbolic throne. Sitting on this throne gives a woman a sense of belonging, of emotional influence, of being needed. It can quietly hold up her self-worth, shape her identity, and define her place in the family structure. But this throne isn't bolted to the ground. When another woman enters the picture, the daughter-in-law, it can feel like that sacred space is under siege. The daughter-in-law may not be trying to be disrespectful or assert dominance. Sometimes her simple presence is enough to make the mother-in-law feel that things are shifting. The son, once so emotionally tied to his mother, now seeks the counsel of another woman. The decisions she used to make for him, they now make together without asking for her input. The rhythms of family life begin to change, the meals, the schedules, the shared rituals. Suddenly it seems everything is slipping through the matriarch's fingers. And now the mother-in-law faces what Freud called one of the greatest challenges to the ego, being pushed out of the center. According to Freud, the ego fights desperately to maintain control and stay in the spotlight. It resists loss, especially when that loss doesn't involve a physical object, but rather the symbolic space the person has long occupied. So the mother-in-law isn't just losing her son's attention, she feels like she's losing her central role in the family story, and that even if no one says it out loud, can hurt deeply. But this pain rarely gets acknowledged directly. It tends to show up instead as criticism toward the daughter-in-law, as interference, as a strong urge to reassert her authority. At its core, the unconscious motive is to hang on to that symbolic throne. The conflict isn't truly about the daughter-in-law herself, it's about what she represents. She marks the end of an era, a signal that it's time to step back, a painful reminder that time has moved on. Yet when this pain is named for what it is, something begins to shift. When the mother-in-law admits her struggle with letting go of the center stage, she begins a deeper inner process, one of reflection and redefinition. She comes to understand that stepping out of her son's life isn't necessary for him to build his own family. In fact, she realizes that the respect she longs for can't be commanded or enforced, it's earned by the grace with which she handles her changing role. On her side, the daughter-in-law. Once she begins to see that her mother-in-law's hostility might stem from this symbolic loss, starts to approach things with more empathy, not to submit or accept everything blindly, but to stop taking the barbs personally. She begins to see that the conflict isn't truly about her. It's about a space of emotional significance that the mother-in-law is afraid of losing. Freud teaches us that growing up mentally always comes with some degree of loss. But those losses can turn into gains if we accept them with awareness. A mother-in-law who makes room for others without bitterness doesn't lose her place. She reshapes it. She evolves from the ruling matriarch into a source of quiet wisdom. Once the focal point of attention, she becomes the keeper of memory, a deep listener, a well of experience. And while this new role may not shine as brightly, it's far more grounded, enduring, and real. In the end, the clash between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law only erupts when we fail to acknowledge that roles are shifting and the ego must learn to reposition itself. When that shift happens consciously, a new kind of bond can emerge, more balanced, more respectful, and deeply human. Freud said that real maturity is about coming to terms with loss, not just losing people, but also letting go of roles, cherished self-images, and the illusion of control. And when we face those losses with eyes wide open, they don't weaken us, they strengthen us. Where wounded pride once stood, humility takes root. And in the space once filled with the need to remain at the center, a new freedom appears, the freedom to choose what truly matters. Within the family landscape, the mother-in-law's role is one of the most sensitive. She's already walked through the seasons of youth, of raising children, of leading and deciding. She was once the organizer, the one who voiced opinions and called the shots. For years, she held together the emotional fabric of her home. She nurtured, she mediated, she carried burdens. But now a new generation is stepping into that position. And this transition can feel like a kind of fading of importance, of influence, of being heard. If not understood, it breeds resentment, sorrow, and bitterness. But there's another way, the path of those who embrace growing older with grace. Those who realize that their place in their children's hearts isn't something to defend, it's something that can evolve. Love isn't measured by how often advice is given or how many visits take place, but by the depth of what's been built over time. Even as dynamics shift, the shared history remains. A mother-in-law who's come to terms with her own unconscious begins to see beyond rivalry. She understands that her daughter-in-law isn't an adversary, but a woman finding her way, just as she once did. She recognizes that beneath the younger woman's behavior might lie fears of not being accepted, insecurities about living up to expectations, and a deep longing to belong. This kind of understanding, born not from theory, but from lived experience, doesn't shrink the heart. It enlarges it. The battle ends when the mother-in-law stops trying to win. When she realizes her real victory lies in not needing to prove anything, not having to claim space, not demanding recognition. Because in truth, she's already recognized, maybe not in the way she once imagined, but in the eyes of her grandchildren, in the memories held by her children, in the life story she carries in her body and soul. As Freud once said, maturity is that point where we stop compulsively repeating the past and start deliberately choosing the present. It's when the older woman can finally lay down the role she's carried for decades, not out of defeat, but out of wisdom. The wisdom of someone who knows she's done enough, given enough, born enough, and is now free to love in a different way. This new love speaks softly, but it runs deep. It watches without judging. It welcomes without taking over. It listens without cutting in. It gives space. It doesn't cling. It doesn't force. And because it grows from inner freedom, not from a need to control it, holds a quiet power all its own. In the end, the mother-in-law doesn't lose her place. She simply stops fighting for a seat she never truly had to defend. She's a woman who's lived, who's made mistakes, who's grown, and who now looks at the next generation not as a threat, but as a continuation. She recognizes her own dignity, not the kind that demands to be feared, but the kind that naturally earns respect. This woman chooses peace, not the kind that depends on others, but the kind that rises from within. The peace of someone who has made peace with her own story, with the time that's passed, with the choices she's made. The peace of knowing that real love doesn't need the spotlight, just presence. And that sometimes the wisest act of love is stepping aside so something new can begin. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you've made it this far, then something deep inside you recognizes the quiet power of transformation, the kind that doesn't shout or demand, but whispers with wisdom. Today, we explored more than just a relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. We uncovered a hidden passage, one that leads from rivalry to reverence, from wounded pride to graceful presence. As Freud reminded us, true maturity is learning how to release the roles we've clung to, not in defeat, but in dignity. It's realizing that love isn't about holding the center, it's about becoming the ground beneath it. And perhaps the most powerful space we can ever occupy is the one we no longer need to defend. So if today's story stirred something in your soul, if it reminded you of someone, or maybe helped you forgive someone, then this journey has already done its quiet work. Until next time, may you walk gently with your past, stand tall in your present, and let go with love. I'm grateful for your presence here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a little light today. See you in the next story where the unseen becomes clear and the forgotten becomes sacred.